From KCRW, this is Here Be Monsters.
The only bear that's ever scared me is one that I never saw. One night in the dry forests of eastern Washington, back when I was 13 years old, I ran for my life. I ran into the dark with untied shoes, in my pajamas, without a flashlight. And I never saw it. I only heard it crashing through the underbrush behind me. And this incident, let's call it that, the incident. It just never sat right with me. And now, half a lifetime later, I'm still thinking about that betrayal. You see, I've seen a lot of bears in my life, mostly grizzlies, and mostly through a couple layers of thick metal fencing. There's this place in my hometown where you can go and watch them. There's a parking lot at the bottom of a hill and an ice cream store nearby, and you can go and take your waffle cone and just watch a couple bears being bears through that fence. Mostly they just sit there. Sometimes they bathe or play, but mostly they just sit there and look unimpressed. As long as I can remember, I've had a psychic connection with animals. All of them. Nothing special, really. I've just always felt clued into the conversations of nature. I used to share entire dialogues with animals, and we'd talk and talk and talk. But eventually I lost those words. And nowadays, my abilities exist only as exchanges of knowing looks. When I was a young adult, I was backpacking on the edge of a valley near sundown, and I looked half a mile across that valley to see a black bear, matching my pace. We walked in the same direction for some time, just sharing occasional glances. Then she went off on her way, and I went off on my own. And it was fine. When I was a kid, my dad bought a hunting rifle, .22 caliber. We shot targets in the back field for a year or two, and it was fine. But eventually he asked me to go hunting with him, and I cried and cried and cried until he gave up. But I'm getting away from my point here. What we're talking about is the incident and why it happened. I hold my parents blameless, and I think the Girl Scouts were unfairly scapegoated. I don't even blame Junior for the incident. Because at the end of the day, I know it was really the fault of the middle management. And Kinnikinnick.
Here Be Monsters, the podcast about
another scouting skill that you'll actually use.
The podcast about
the unknown.
It's worth pointing out that all I'm telling you has been sifted through 15 years of bad memory, years of my attempts to understand the incident and everything that led up to it. I've corroborated my account where possible through other people, old newsletters, photographs, but the Boy Scouts won't return my emails, and I can't find anyone else who was there at camp with me that year. I definitely can't find Nick. So most of this is just me, and a handful of scenes that have been seared into my mind by the blue flame of truth and the red flames of embellishment. With that being said, I think it was $20. It was $20 that my parents gave me to spend at the camping supply store. The kind of store with high ceilings and a rock wall, waterproof matches, freeze-dried ice cream. My parents gave me this money as a gesture of goodwill after telling me that I was going to go to Boy Scout leadership camp whether I wanted to or not. It was really wishful thinking on their part, thinking that I could be turned strong-willed by a week of Boy Scouting in the woods. I just don't remember being a bold child. I remember being quite timid, quite weird, very tall. I quit basketball because the coach yelled at me. I quit baseball after the season where my greatest single achievement was a foul ball that I hit all the way into the parking lot, where it made a satisfying popping noise when it bounced off the roof of a sedan. And when I played Monopoly, I hid money under the board to dodge the income tax. I valued magic more than work. I believed in telekinesis, I talked to animals with my mind. I'd recently become a vegetarian. I don't know anyone back then who would have said I was a leader. No, if they were being generous, they might have called me stealthy. Regardless, I was going to leadership camp, and I had a $20 bill in my cargo shorts. And so I bought a flashlight, the Brinkmann Rebel, notable only for being especially dim and for having a detachable red filter made for sneaking around in the night. The camp was a dry forest on a hill by a lake. Pine trees and ferns all covered in dust. A plant with shiny leaves grew everywhere. I stood in the parking lot wearing my full uniform, scout socks, scout shorts, scout belt, shirt, hat, neckerchief, and my mom's old hiking backpack. I saw a slow stream of other boys, aged 10 to 18. They were all trickling uphill, and I joined in. We all wound up in a long, narrow, grassy field with campfire pits at the far end. The camp's middle management stopped us, and down the line they searched us each for contraband, and they took anything away from us that had been invented for the purpose of bringing joy to the world. Candy, Game Boys, Discmen, Pokemon cards, fingerboards. It felt draconian, but it made enough sense.
But in reality, there is something serious, something mighty big behind this great jamboree. It plants a milestone in the history of scouting.
The camp's general philosophy was that modern American boys were too soft. Society's comforts had weakened him, coddled his ego, softened his edges. But in the wilderness, with society's comforts taken away, he would learn tough love and leadership.
And the physical, mental, and moral health it has been to millions of boys all over the world.
I'm sure it was coincidence that there were bullets in the ground there. It was another boy who pointed it out to me. Each night, the middle management gave announcements, praises, and reprimands, and sang songs, did scout stuff. And all the while, this other boy and I, we'd sift our hands through the dirt, find little melted pieces of lead, put them in piles, then put those piles in our pockets.
A living monument to Sir Baden Powell, who founded the Boy Scout movement little more than a quarter of a century ago.
Middle management handed me back my bag. They gave me an animal name, Bull, and they told me to go and find the other bulls. This would be my group. I could see them there, those other bulls, across the abandoned rifle range, over by the 2 giant campfire pits. They were standing in a circle. And despite being an animal known for strength and virility, I could tell that us bulls represented a weaker sect of boy, paler and meeker than most. The meekest and palest among us was named Nick. He might have been 18. He called me into the circle. Nick was very tall, incredibly skinny, perpetually nervous. He had freckles everywhere. His eyes darted around a lot. And his hair was ginger, long, and curly, down around his shoulders. And when he ran, it flew out straight behind him like the tail of a red comet. Though now, in hindsight, I've come to understand Nick as somewhat more of a wood nymph. The sort of creature that a child might lure into an old jelly jar to keep as a pet. But Nick was too crafty. And while the other wood nymphs were caught up and taken away by children, Nick continued to make his home under a pine tree and lick the dew off of its needles. He survived because he tempered his sense of magic with a deep mistrust of the outside world. The green and khaki of scouting uniforms don't look good on anyone. But on Nick, these clothes seemed especially strange. He introduced himself, made us do the same, told us that from here on out, we would be a tribe, and that he, Nick, would be our leader, the leader of the bulls, and that was it. He nearly danced up the trail ahead of us. He led us up through the trees, into the woods, away from the other boys. He took us to a clearing where he'd already pitched his tent. We dropped our bags and Nick took us to the nearby access road. There was a picnic table there, and between all of us we muscled it back to the campsite, along with grocery bags of hot dogs and canned corn, Swiss Miss and instant oatmeal. And then Nick was gone. I could see his red hair trailing off into the forest as he skirted tree trunks and jumped over ferns. There we were, a dozen teenagers in the woods. I set up my tent. I propped up the egos of the other boys who weakly vied for power. Nothing ever really came of that. And as the sun went down, I holstered my flashlight into my scouting belt, and I ate oatmeal while the others ate hot dogs. I thought I saw the genius of Nick's strategy here, to teach us the value of leadership by taking himself out of the picture, to see how we'd fare by ourselves. I thought that he might be watching us from behind one of those trees, to make sure that some Lord of the Flies shit didn't go down. But he wasn't. As nighttime came, we sifted back down the hill as a group. There we sat on benches at the end of that old rifle range. And as we sat, the other tribes, the lions, the ospreys, etc., all emerged from the trees and sat around us. All together we watched as the middle management stood between the two large red-flamed campfires and gave those announcements, sang the songs, gave the praises and reprimands. And all the while, my hands drifted off the side of the bench to sift dirt between my fingers and search for those squashed lead bullets. Each one looked like a little flower, or maybe a frozen pea that someone had chewed on for a while. Something was brewing here.
The incident.
Though I didn't know it yet. Later that night, back at Bull Camp, I crawled into my sleeping bag and I imagined myself lying on my back in the middle of a huge meadow, miles wide, covered in tall grass and daisies. This imagination trick is something that I figured out when I was quite young. I imagine myself there, in whatever I'm wearing, lying on my back in the grass. Then slowly I lift up off of the earth, slowly up past the top of the grass, looking at the clouds and the blue sky, floating past the butterflies and bees working their jobs around me. Then 3 feet off the ground, I roll to the right, and I look down at the squashed grass where I once lay, and at the bees and bugs and flowers, and I watch the wind ripple through the grass, and then I start to fly, first in wide circles, then faster and faster, subtle swoops and big banked corners. I let the top of the grass tickle my nose. And when I've had enough, then I fly for the edge of the yellow meadow where I can see that there's a deep, green, dark forest that's both lush and frightening. I fly right for it, accelerating, accelerating, accelerating. And without fail, I'm asleep before I ever reach the trees. It was mid-morning when Nick reappeared. We had already finished breakfast. He came into camp carrying a huge amount of rope. He told us to gather sticks and branches from the surrounding woods. So we went into the forest, avoiding the strange plant with the shiny leaves. It seemed to be growing everywhere. We pulled logs and sticks and twigs back into the campsite, piled them high.
You have to build a tower.
Nick told us.
It can be anything,
He said.
but I'd recommend a land diving tower.
He explained to us the wooden towers built each spring in the South Pacific nation of Vanuatu. Young men climb these towers and tie a long vine to the top. The other end they tie around their leg. They cross their arms and jump with the faith that the vine's been correctly measured.
So yeah,
He said.
get going.
And with that, Nick disappeared back into the forest, leaving nothing more than a giant coil of rope and a certain sense of vagueness. We certainly never built that tower, though I did rummage through the pile to find a long, straight staff, nearly my height, and I found a tree that was bleeding sap badly, and I stuck my new staff in the wound and I twisted it around until it was covered in sticky. I spent the day crudely carving the face of a bull into my staff, and then at nightfall, I left my flashlight behind, lit my staff on fire, and walked down to the rifle range for our all-camp meeting, dripping drops of blue flame behind me. Nick's ass was the first thing I saw of him the next morning. It was breakfast time, and he was off in the distance, behind a log that hid him only from the calves down. He pulled up his pants and yelled for us to come over. He said,
It's important that you know how to take a dump in the woods.
He pointed at his pile and at a piece of toilet paper. Then he shoveled them into a little hole, covered it with dirt, and put a big leaf on top.
Now there's a scouting skill you'll actually use.
And that was the last we saw of him that day. At the evening gathering, I sat on the hill with my fingers searching the dirt for dead bullets, while the middle management told us not to bother the Girl Scouts down the road. The next afternoon, Nick appeared in camp to tell us that we were going to learn plant identification. He smiled and flourished and said,
Another scouting skill that you'll actually use.
He pointed to that shrubby plant that grew everywhere, the one with the shiny leaves. It looked nothing special to me, he said.
This is an important plant. You need to remember that. And what you need to do is you need to pick as much of it as you can. You need to pick it every day. Dry out the leaves on the rocks in the sun.
The shrubby plant that Nick pointed to was Arctostaphylos uva ursi, the bear's grape, bearberry. It's a common plant, known for its bunches of red berries that grow in the autumn. But Nick was not interested in the berries. He was interested in the leaves, which he called Kinnikinnick. He said it over and over again. Kinnikinnick, Kinnikinnick. Kinnikinnick is an Algonquin word that translates roughly to mixture, referring to a blend of herbs mixed in with smoking tobacco. This mixture often contains the leaves of bearberries, and there are historical documents made by European settlers that claimed Kinnikinnick to be an intoxicant, though these kind of documents are notoriously unreliable, and it's almost certain that misunderstandings, both accidental and intentional, have slipped in. And case in point, Nick said to us,
And once the Kinnikinnick is dry, you gotta roll it up and smoke it. It'll get you high. Really, really high. Like you'll hallucinate and go crazy. It's like doing acid times 100. You gotta smoke it.
And with that, he was off again.
Kinnikinnick.
Kinnikinnick, Kinnikinnick.
It was the fourth day when Junior first showed up. Junior was a gnome-like boy. He had the face of a supporting character and a messy bowl cut of black hair. He followed Nick into camp that fourth morning holding an empty 2-liter bottle of Mountain Dew. Nick gathered us around to announce that we would be learning another lesson today, and then he and Junior began a complicated process that involved filling the bottle with water, folding sheets of aluminum foil. Junior pulled out a pocket knife and poked a couple holes in the bottle, and quickly, Nick pulled out a little pile of leaves and lit them on fire, placed them on the bottle's top. 3 rivers of water poured out, and smoke filled the vacuum. Nick took a huge rip off the bottle, and then, through coughs, an unusually sober voice, he said,
That's how you make a gravity bong. A valuable scouting skill that you can actually use. Now who wants to buy some weed?
That night, middle management stood in front of the twin campfires. They told us that there had been some concerning developments with the Girl Scouts down the road. They said that the Girl Scouts were feeding a bear, leaving camp food out for it. They lectured us from between the fires, telling us that bears have torn people to shreds for less than hot dogs. Nature is not a plaything. Nick started showing up in camp less predictably. He returned late each night and left in the mornings before I woke up. There were no more scouting lessons. Sometimes, Junior would shuffle into camp in his gnome-like way. He was always looking for Nick. The giant pile of sticks and logs for our land diving tower went untouched. Spiders took up residence in there, building their tangle webs as the forest's first step of reclamation. I braved the pile once when I wanted a bigger staff stick. The spiders knew I meant no harm, and we silently communicated our mutual displeasure of the bull camp, and silently communicated my confusion with what I was supposed to be learning and how I was supposed to be learning it. I found my new staff, carved it better, and made a bigger reservoir for sap. I stole more blood from the dying tree nearby. This staff was good, so good that I stopped carrying my flashlight with me altogether. Strange to think that I'd lusted after a flashlight just 1 week prior. At night, I'd take my staff with me to the all-camp meetings, where the middle management gave us updates on the bear. Someone had seen it on the road, possibly with cubs. Another had seen it upending our trash cans. Another had seen it in the lower camp, down by the lake. They warned us that the Girl Scouts had acclimatized it to humans. They'd made it expectant of food, and more dangerous by the day. I felt no particular animus, though. Nick was all but gone. The spiders multiplied. They extended their range. Patches of bearberry encroached on the camp. Our last night at the all-camp meeting, boys from the other groups, the Foxes, the Osprey, etc., they were all saying goodbye to each other, enjoying their last night with their new friends. I couldn't find the boy who taught me to hunt bullets. There was no news of the bear. I again wondered what I was supposed to have learned. I wondered if the lesson was supposed to be that of radical self-reliance, or perhaps it was dominion over nature. Perhaps it was the unlocking of my leadership instinct. Perhaps it was the uncoddling of my masculinity. I couldn't tell, so I filled my pockets with more dead bullets, stared into the twin campfires, and lit my torch. Back in my tent, I half attempted to pack up. The flashlight was now lost somewhere in the swirl of my belongings, buried in the tent floor in a mix of scout socks, toiletries, and little bits of rope. I went to sleep that night, skimming the tips of the meadow with my nose, flying towards the tree line. A wild mixture of sounds tore me from the meadow, the crashing of cloth and nylon tents, the bleary yells of bulls running into the darkness, and the dramatic yells of the middle management screaming, "Run! Run! Run!" And that's how I wound up in the forest with my shoes untied, without flashlight, my stumbles guided by just some sliver of moon. And I ran, and I ran, and I ran, and the further I ran, the quieter the sounds of yelling and tents crashing became. But I ran with that certainty that everyone feels when they're running in fear. It's that certainty that your adversary is nipping at your heels, that danger lurks around every corner. It's that state that a gerbil resides in permanently, where personal identity is instantly replaced by a deep survival urge to just run, just run, just run from an animal that's mistook you for its food. My primal fear turned to anger when I realized that I was alone in my crashing through the forest. I felt no bear, no eyes watching me, no wordless conversations taking place. And for several moments I was alone in unfamiliar woods, surrounded by moonlit pines, sword ferns, patches of bearberry. I don't actually remember how I wound up back at camp. I think a staffer with a flashlight might have seen me running off into the forest by myself. Or maybe I just traced my way back downhill by following the smashed plants that I'd left in my wake. Either way, the camp was still chaotic when I returned. The other bulls were in one corner of the campsite, and middle management were everywhere with flashlights, rifling through the contents of each tent, emptying out our bags, flipping over our sleeping pads, shaking out pillowcases. And so I asked a staffer what had happened to the bear, and they told me the truth. They told me that they had just needed an excuse to get us out of our tents, because someone had been selling weed to the campers. The next morning, Nick was gone. So was his tent. So I repacked my bag, took down my own tent, and for the first time that week, I took some initiative. I ordered the rest of the bulls to search the camp for extra cocoa packets, canned corn, and instant oatmeal. They did. I boiled some water, mixed it together real thick to make a loose brown paste, and then I carefully rolled out 4 perfect synthetic turds. They were beautiful. We left one at each of the 3 entrances to Camp Bull, and the 4th one, the largest of the bunch, I put right in the middle of our picnic table. And for the last time, I headed downhill, staff in hand. This time not to the rifle range, but to a huge open field by the lake, with a couple of flagpoles in the middle, and a building off to the side. And I looked through the building's many windows, where I could clearly see Nick in there, put on display. Junior was there too, along with some boys that I didn't recognize. Nick was motionless, sitting on the floor, head down resting on his knees, his long, curly red hair draped across his legs. He might have been crying. And that's the last image I have of Kinnikinnick Nick, there in his glass cage. Wild creature, once free, now captured, put in an old jelly jar. I saluted the flag and walked back to the parking lot and waited for my family to come take me home for my week of leadership training. I used to think I gained nothing from that camp, and now I know I was wrong about that. I gained a lot, actually. I gained a walking staff taller than I was. I got a free flashlight that I still have and still never use. I gained a few new scouting skills: bong making, plant ID, proper dump technique. I gained a lasting resentment of middle management. I gained a pocket full of melted bullets. And I gained some complicated feelings about bears that I resolved over the course of several years by buying an ice cream cone and taking it down to that parking lot at the bottom of the hill in my hometown, where the metal fences separated me from a couple lazy grizzlies. They might catch the scent of mint chip melting down the back of my hand, but they do little more than raise their heads, look me square in the eyes with knowing looks, and lay their heads back down in their giant paws to take a nap. And it was fine. This episode of Here Be Monsters was written and produced by me, Jeff Emtman. I had help from Bethany, Denton, and our editor at KCRW, our favorite middle manager, Nick White.
Kinnikinnick White.
Music on this episode came from The Black Spot. You know, there's no doubt in my mind that my memory is faulty here. It's just been too long. And so I'm dying to hear Kinnikinnick Nick's side of this story. But I have no idea where he is, and I can't find anyone who knows him. So in the off chance that you've heard of him, we'd love your help tracking him down. Just write us an email. Our contact info is up on our website, which is hbmpodcast.com. There, you'll also find all of our old episodes, links to our brand new Instagram account, and a picture of me in my scouting uniform at that camp. Again, we're at hbmpodcast.com. You'll remember that at the end of last season, we did a call for t-shirt art for our second ever podcast shirt, and we got so many submissions, thank you all. And after a lot of deliberation, Beth and I selected a design. It's by Adam Fain of Portland, Oregon, and we love how striking this design is. It's a background of these really delicate lines, like the rings of a giant tree, and on top of that, there are these just very heavy and chaotic blots of ink. And buried inside those splotchy blots is our HBM logo. We've commissioned a small run of these shirts from the notorious Seattle-based print shop Restless Prints, and they look great. The place to go is hbmpodcast.com/store. And like I said, we did a pretty small run of these, so if you want one, be sure to head over to our website soon. If we do sell out, don't worry, we are going to make more, but probably with different colors. So go to hbmpodcast.com/store to get your very affordable Here Be Monsters t-shirt. And before I end all this, I just want to give you a quick podcast recommendation. Listen to The Organist. The infinite is possible at The Organist. The unattainable is unknown at The Organist. Here Be Monsters is a part of KCRW's independent producer project. Thanks for listening. More episodes soon.